In the financial capital of a nation home to 1.4 billion people, a former central banker turned prime minister delivered what may become the most consequential foreign policy address Canada has made in decades. Mark Carney stood before India's most powerful business leaders in Mumbai, and without once naming the President of the United States, laid out a comprehensive indictment of American trade policy, American economic coercion, and what he described as the deliberate weaponization of financial interdependence. This was not a speech designed for domestic applause. This was a signal broadcast across multiple continents, a signal that Canada is no longer waiting for permission, a signal that the rules of North American economic integration are being rewritten, and a signal that middle powers across the globe are beginning to coordinate their responses to a new era of transactional superpower politics. What Carney outlined in Mumbai was not complaint, it was doctrine. To understand the weight of this moment, one must first understand what the last 2 decades have done to the architecture of global trade. The 2008 financial crisis exposed the fragility of interconnected banking systems. Supply chains that once symbolized efficiency became vectors of contagion. Entire economies discovered that optimization had come at the cost of resilience. Then came the pandemic. Borders closed overnight. Medical supply chains collapsed under political pressure. Nations that had outsourced critical production found themselves begging for masks, ventilators, and vaccines from the same countries they had depended on for cheap labor. Energy shocks followed. The war in Ukraine revealed how thoroughly Europe had tied its industrial base to Russian natural gas. What had been framed as economic partnership was exposed as strategic vulnerability, and through each of these crises, a pattern emerged. The same systems designed to promote prosperity were being turned into instruments of pressure. Sanctions, export controls, tariff threats, and financial access became tools of statecraft. Scholars began calling it weaponized interdependence, the idea that in a deeply connected world, the nation that controls the choke points controls the leverage. This is the environment Mark Carney inherited, and this is the environment he addressed in Mumbai. The setting was deliberate. India represents the fastest-growing major economy on Earth, a nation actively seeking to reduce its own dependence on any single trading partner, and a democracy with which Canada shares both values and strategic interests. Carney arrived not as a supplicant, but as an architect. He came with proposals, frameworks, and a message that extended far beyond bilateral commerce. Throughout the address, Carney never named Donald Trump, not once. But every paragraph carried the unmistakable fingerprint of American policy under the current administration. References to tariffs imposed without negotiation, accusations of coercion dressed as commerce, descriptions of a trading partner that treats market access as a transaction rather than a relationship. The subtext was obvious to everyone in the room. What made the speech remarkable was not its criticism, but its restraint. Carney offered diagnosis where others have offered outrage. He presented analysis rather than grievance. And in doing so, he positioned Canada not as a victim of American overreach, but as a rational actor preparing for structural realignment. This was a speech designed to be quoted in foreign ministries from Brussels to Tokyo. To understand Carney's response, one must first understand the policy he was responding to. The Trump administration has made no secret of its position. The president has stated publicly that foreign nations should expect to pay for the privilege of accessing the American consumer market. This is not framed as protectionism in the traditional sense. It is framed as reciprocity. The argument is that decades of trade agreements have allowed other nations to benefit from American demand while restricting American exports through non-tariff barriers, subsidies, and regulatory asymmetry. The legal mechanisms have followed. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act allows the president to impose tariffs on national security grounds. Section 122 of the Trade Act permits temporary tariffs to address balance of payments concerns. Both have been deployed or threatened with increasing frequency. Beyond emergency measures, there is growing discussion within the administration of baseline tariffs, a permanent floor of 10 to 15% applied universally to all imports. This would represent a fundamental departure from the post-war consensus. It would signal that the United States views tariffs not as leverage for negotiation, but as structural policy. The question that haunts every trade ministry in the world is whether this posture is temporary or permanent. Is this a negotiating stance designed to extract concessions, or is it a long-term reorientation of American economic philosophy? Carney's speech suggested Canada is no longer willing to wait for the answer. The Prime Minister did not travel to India to complain. He traveled to build. The core of Carney's message was strategic autonomy. The phrase appeared repeatedly, always in the context of reducing dependence on any single market, even one as large as the United States. Canada, Carney argued, must diversify, not as a reaction to any single administration, but as a permanent feature of national economic policy. The goal is not to replace the American market. The goal is to ensure that no single market can be used as a choke point. He spoke of building 10 markets instead of relying on one, of pursuing trade agreements across the Indo-Pacific, deepening ties with Europe, and accelerating engagement with emerging economies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But diversification alone is insufficient without domestic transformation. Carney outlined a suite of policies designed to make Canada one of the most competitive investment destinations in the developed world. A super deduction allowing businesses to write off 100% of new capital investments. Clean energy tax credits designed to attract manufacturing in sectors critical to the energy transition. A marginal effective tax rate reduced to 13%, a figure 4.5 points below the current United States rate and roughly half the average across the G7. He announced a commitment to approve major projects within 2 years, eliminating the regulatory uncertainty that has long plagued Canadian resource development. And he signaled a significant expansion of defense spending, framing it not as a concession to American pressure, but as a necessary investment in Canadian sovereignty. The total value of the industrial strategy he described exceeds $500 billion. What Carney presented was not merely a policy platform, it was a philosophy of governance. One model of leadership, he implied, reacts to volatility. It responds to tweets, adjusts to threats, and negotiates from a position of perpetual uncertainty. This model treats every tariff announcement as a crisis and every presidential statement as a binding constraint. The other model builds structural resilience. It assumes volatility is permanent and designs systems capable of absorbing shocks. It does not wait for clarity from Washington. It creates clarity through domestic action and international partnership. Carney's message to Canadian business was explicit. Stop waiting for the next tweet. Stop hoping for a return to normalcy. The old rules are not coming back. The only rational response is to build an economy that does not require them. This shift from defensive posture to proactive alliance building represents a fundamental reorientation. Canada is no longer asking for exemptions. It is building alternatives. And the partnership with India, Carney made clear, is central to that effort. The Indo-Pacific is not a secondary concern. It is the primary arena of 21st century economic competition. The implications of this speech extend far beyond Canada. What Carney articulated is part of a broader shift away from the United States-centric trade order that has defined the global economy since 1945. That order was built on American security guarantees, American consumer demand, and American willingness to run persistent trade deficits in exchange for geopolitical loyalty. That bargain is fraying, and middle powers are beginning to respond. The rise of middle power coalitions is one of the defining features of the current geopolitical moment. Nations like Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and increasingly India are exploring frameworks for economic cooperation that do not depend on American leadership. Strategic autonomy is becoming doctrine, not as a rejection of the United States, but as insurance against its unpredictability. Carney's speech also reflected what might be called value-based realism. The partnerships Canada is pursuing are not purely transactional. They are grounded in shared governance norms, democratic accountability, and rules-based dispute resolution. This is a deliberate contrast with the purely transactional posture Carney attributed to current American policy. The end result, if sustained, is a more multipolar economic alignment, not a single alternative to the United States, but a network of interlocking relationships that collectively reduce American leverage. This was not a speech about tariffs. This was a speech about power. Mark Carney did not travel to India to vent frustration. He traveled to announce a doctrine that rejects the premise that middle powers must accept whatever terms the largest economy offers. A doctrine that treats diversification not as disloyalty, but as prudence. A doctrine that answers economic coercion with economic independence. Canada will not pay for access. Canada will build leverage. Whether this strategy succeeds remains to be seen. Diversification is expensive. Regulatory reform is difficult. Defense expansion is politically contentious. And the gravitational pull of the American market is not easily escaped. But the ambition is unmistakable, and the message has been received in capitals around the world. The question now is whether other nations will follow, whether the frameworks Carney proposed will attract genuine participation. and whether the architecture of global trade is truly entering a period of fundamental reconstruction. As the exchange continues, the tension that John Kennedy carefully introduced in the first half begins to fully surface. What initially appeared to be a straightforward oversight discussion now transforms into something deeper, a confrontation between expectations of transparency and the institutional realities described by Kash Patel. Kennedy doesn't raise his voice or dramatically accuse anyone. Instead, he does something more effective. He narrows the focus. He strips away the broader political framing and reduces the issue to a single, persistent question. If Jeffrey Epstein committed these crimes, was he truly acting alone? This is where the contradiction becomes more visible. Earlier, Patel strongly emphasized the FBI's capabilities: thousands of arrests, rapid investigations, coordinated enforcement. The message was clear: this is an agency that delivers results. But now, when pressed on Epstein, Patel leans on limitations, restricted evidence, past investigative failures, and binding court orders. It's not that his explanation lacks logic. In fact, from a legal standpoint, it is consistent. Investigations are constrained by what evidence is admissible, what warrants allow, and what courts permit to be disclosed. Patel repeatedly reinforces this point. The FBI cannot act on speculation, and it cannot release information that is not legally cleared. But Kennedy isn't questioning the law. He's questioning the outcome. He highlights a contrast that resonates beyond the hearing room. In recent cases, suspects were identified within hours. Complex networks involving drugs, weapons, and organized crime have been dismantled using modern investigative tools. Yet here, in a case spanning decades involving high-profile connections and international movement, the conclusion presented is that there is no credible information pointing to additional individuals. That gap between capability and conclusion is where public skepticism grows. Patel attempts to close that gap by returning to the origins of the case. He emphasizes again that the early investigation, particularly the non-prosecution agreement negotiated by Alexander Acosta, effectively narrowed the scope of everything that followed. According to this explanation, the system didn't fail recently. It was structurally limited from the beginning. This is a critical point. If the foundational investigation was incomplete or constrained, then every subsequent review inherits those limitations. Evidence that was never collected cannot be analyzed later. Leads that were never pursued cannot be revisited with certainty. In this sense, Patel is arguing that the current lack of answers is not due to inaction, but due to missing pieces that were never secured in the first place. However, Kennedy subtly challenges this narrative, not by directly disputing it, but by reframing the issue around public expectation. He points out that the American people are not asking for speculation or assumptions. They are asking for clarity. They understand that Epstein's crimes were real and documented. What they struggle to accept is the idea that such an operation existed in isolation, without any broader network or participation. This is where the conversation shifts from legal reasoning to perception. Patel acknowledges this frustration. He doesn't dismiss it. In fact, he explicitly states that he understands why people are unsatisfied with the answers, but he draws a firm boundary. The FBI can only present what it can prove. It does not release unverified claims, and it does not name individuals without evidence that meets prosecutorial standards. This position reflects a core principle of the justice system: presumption of innocence and protection against defamation. But in high-profile cases, especially ones surrounded by years of speculation, that principle can feel at odds with public demand for transparency. Kennedy's questioning exposes that tension without needing to argue it directly. Then comes another important layer: the issue of document release. Patel reiterates that the Department of Justice and the FBI are working to release as much information as legally possible. However, he emphasizes that 3 separate court orders restrict full disclosure. These orders, issued by judges, prevent the release of certain materials, likely due to concerns about privacy, ongoing legal protections, or the integrity of past proceedings. According to Patel, efforts have been made to have these restrictions lifted, but those efforts were denied. As a result, the agencies are operating within a fixed legal boundary. They can comply with congressional requests and public interest only to the extent that the law allows. This introduces a key structural reality. Transparency is not solely controlled by the FBI or the Department of Justice. It is also shaped by the judiciary. For many observers, however, this explanation may feel incomplete. The idea that critical information exists but cannot be shared creates a perception gap. Even if the reasoning is legally sound, the lack of visibility fuels further questions. Kennedy captures this sentiment in a simple but powerful way. He says the issue is not going to go away. Attempt to overpromise. He does not claim that hidden revelations are coming or that a breakthrough is imminent. Instead, he maintains a consistent line. If credible evidence emerges, it will be investigated. If legally permissible information can be released, it will be shared. This approach prioritizes institutional integrity over public speculation. But it also leaves a narrative gap, one that others are quick to fill with their own interpretations. By the end of the exchange, the contrast Kennedy constructed is fully visible. On one side, there is an image of a highly capable, efficient FBI, one that can respond quickly, solve cases, and deliver measurable results. On the other side, there is a complex, constrained system, one that operates within legal be reconsidered, and if information exists but cannot be fully disclosed, how should the public interpret that silence? These are not questions that Patel answers directly, nor are they questions that Kennedy explicitly resolves. Instead, they linger, left for the audience, the public, and future investigations to grapple with. What the exchange ultimately reveals is not a clear conclusion, but a clear tension between what can be proven and what people believe must be true, between legal process and public expectation, between institutional limits and the demand for complete transparency. And as Kennedy noted, that tension isn't going away anytime soon.